The autumn fair had transformed the small town of Pine Grove into a vibrant celebration of community spirit. Amidst the cheerful chaos of carnival rides and cotton candy stands, a modest woodworking booth stood out for its craftsmanship. Behind the display of intricately carved furniture sat Tom, a soft-spoken carpenter in his mid-40s, his weathered hands telling stories of decades spent working with wood. The fair had been peaceful until the rumble of motorcycles cut through the afternoon air. A group of leather-clad bikers rolled in, their presence immediately drawing concerned glances from families enjoying the festivities. The leader, a towering figure with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos, swaggered through the crowd with his crew in tow. Tom watched quietly as they made their way through the fair, his trained eyes noting their movements with the precision of someone who had spent years observing people. While most saw just another carpenter, few knew that Tom had spent 15 years as a SWAT team leader in one of the country's toughest cities. He had traded his tactical gear for woodworking tools 5 years ago, seeking peace in crafting beautiful things with his hands. The trouble began when one of the bikers knocked over a display at the booth next to Tom's, sending handmade jewelry scattering across the ground. The elderly woman running the stall could only watch helplessly as the bikers laughed, their boots crushing delicate pieces underfoot. Tom felt a familiar tension in his shoulders, the kind he used to experience before high-stakes operations, but he remained calm, choosing to observe rather than intervene immediately. The situation escalated when the bikers turned their attention to Tom's booth. The leader picked up a carefully crafted jewelry box, turning it roughly in his hands. "Nice little trinkets you got here, old man," he sneered, deliberately dropping the box back onto the table with enough force to crack its lid. Tom stood slowly, his movements measured and deliberate. "That box took me 3 weeks to make," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being heard without having to raise it. "I'd appreciate it if you'd handle it with more care." The bikers exchanged amused glances, clearly misreading Tom's composed demeanor for weakness. The leader leaned across the table, his face inches from Tom's. "And what if we don't want to be careful with your little toys?" A small crowd had begun to gather, parents pulling their children close, teenagers recording with their phones. Tom noticed a fair security guard in the distance, speaking urgently into his radio, but he knew help would take time to arrive. His mind automatically assessed the situation, just as he had done countless times before. 7 bikers, 2 with concealed weapons bulging under their jackets, the leader clearly used to intimidating people into submission. "You know," Tom began, his voice remaining surprisingly gentle, "I've always believed that craftsmanship teaches us something important about respect. Every piece of wood has its own story, its own strength." He picked up the damaged jewelry box, running his fingers over the crack. "Just like people, you can't always judge them by what you see on the surface." The leader's laugh was harsh. "Are you trying to give us a lesson, old man? Maybe we need to teach you one instead." He reached across the table, grabbing Tom's shirt collar, but his triumphant grin faltered when he felt the solid muscle beneath the flannel fabric. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The fair's cheerful music continued to play in the background, creating an almost surreal contrast to the tension building at the woodworking booth. Tom's next words were spoken so softly that only the leader could hear them. "Before I became a carpenter, I spent my life protecting people from those who confused strength with the right to harm others. I'd rather not revisit those days, but I will if you force my hand." Something in Tom's steady gaze made the leader hesitate. Perhaps it was the complete absence of fear, or the way Tom stood perfectly balanced despite being held by his collar. The biker's grip loosened slightly, uncertainty creeping into his expression for the first time. As the first part of this tense encounter drew to a close, the gathered crowd held their breath, watching this unusual standoff between a seemingly simple carpenter and a group of intimidating bikers. The autumn breeze carried the scent of sawdust and cotton candy, while the future hung balanced on the edge of a decision. Would the bikers recognize the wisdom in backing down, or would they learn the hard way that appearances can be deceiving? The tension at Tom's woodworking booth hung thick in the air like summer storm clouds. The biker leader's hand remained on Tom's collar, but his confident sneer had been replaced by a look of uncertainty. His crew shifted uncomfortably behind him, sensing the change in their leader's demeanor but not understanding its cause. A young mother in the crowd clutched her child closer as she watched the scene unfold. Tom noticed her worry and felt a familiar responsibility settle over him, the same feeling that had guided him through countless SWAT operations. He knew he needed to defuse this situation without violence, not just for himself but for everyone watching. "You've got two choices right now," Tom said, his voice remaining calm and measured. "You can let go of my shirt, and we can have a civilized conversation about respect and craftsmanship. Or you can make a decision you'll regret, and we'll both have to deal with the consequences." His eyes met the biker's, conveying not threat but certainty. The biker's grip loosened further as confusion crossed his face. Something about this Carpenter's quiet confidence had thrown him off balance. His usual intimidation tactics weren't working, and for the first time in years, he felt unsure of himself. Just then, one of the younger bikers, eager to prove himself, stepped forward aggressively. "Boss, this old man's just talking big. Let's show him," but before he could finish, the leader raised his free hand, silencing him. In his years of leading the crew, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming that this situation was different. Tom used this moment of hesitation to continue, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone. "You know, when I'm working with wood, I often find that the strongest pieces are the ones that have weathered the most storms. They've been through tough times but came out stronger." He glanced meaningfully at the leader's weathered face. "I imagine you understand something about that." The leader's hand finally released Tom's collar, and something shifted in his expression. For a brief moment, the hardened exterior cracked, revealing a glimmer of recognition. Tom's words had struck a chord, reminding him of his own journey through life's hardships. The elderly woman whose jewelry had been scattered earlier caught Tom's eye. She was still kneeling, trying to salvage what she could of her work. Without breaking eye contact with the biker leader, Tom spoke again. "A true show of strength isn't in how much we can destroy, but in what we choose to protect and build." To everyone's surprise, the leader turned to look at the jewelry stand. For a moment, he seemed to see not just scattered trinkets, but the hours of careful work they represented. His own mother had been a craftswoman, he remembered suddenly, making beautiful quilts that he'd been too embarrassed to appreciate as a younger man. The fair's ambient sounds began to filter back in, children laughing on nearby rides, music from the carousel, the sweet calls of cotton candy vendors. The leader stood there, caught between his carefully cultivated image and something deeper, something that Tom's words had awakened. One of his crew members shifted uneasily. "Boss?" he questioned, waiting for direction. The crowd held their collective breath, phone still recording, capturing this unexpected moment of transformation. The leader's next move would determine more than just the outcome of this confrontation. It would reveal whether Tom's gentle wisdom could overcome years of practiced intimidation, whether understanding could triumph over force. As the autumn wind rustled through the fair's colorful banners, the possibility of change hung in the balance, proving that sometimes the most powerful moments come not from displays of force, but from the courage to choose a different path. The biker leader's face softened almost imperceptibly as he watched his crew members shifting uncertainly behind him. The tough exterior he'd built over years began to crack, revealing glimpses of someone else beneath, someone he'd almost forgotten existed. He took a deep breath, and the scent of wood shavings from Tom's booth seemed to bring back memories of his father's workshop from decades ago. "My old man was a craftsman too," he said quietly, surprising even himself with the admission. His voice, usually harsh and commanding, carried a note of unexpected vulnerability. "He used to make rocking chairs. Spent weeks on each one, getting every detail just right." Tom nodded, recognizing the moment for what it was, not a surrender, but a bridge. Rocking chairs are some of the most challenging pieces to get right, he replied, reaching for a small wooden piece from his display. The curve has to be perfect, or the whole thing's off balance. He offered the piece to the leader, who took it with unexpected gentleness. The crowd around them had grown larger, but the atmosphere had shifted from fear to fascination. They were witnessing something rare, the moment when understanding began to replace confrontation. The fair's security guards, who had finally arrived, stood back, sensing that intervention would only disrupt whatever was unfolding. The younger biker who had tried to escalate the situation earlier watched in confusion as his leader examined the wooden piece with genuine interest. "Boss, what are you doing?" he demanded, his voice thick with disbelief. "We didn't come here to talk about furniture." The leader turned to face his crew, the wooden piece still in his hand. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the image he'd created pressing down on him. How many times had he chosen intimidation over understanding, force over respect? Tom's quiet strength had shown him a different kind of power, one that didn't require threats or violence to be effective. "No, we didn't," the leader agreed, looking at his young crew member. "But maybe that's exactly why we needed to." He turned back to the elderly woman's scattered jewelry display, his massive frame casting a shadow over the scattered pieces. To everyone's surprise, he knelt down and began carefully gathering the delicate items. His crew watched in stunned silence as their leader, known for destroying things rather than preserving them, gently collected tiny earrings and broken necklaces. After a moment's hesitation, 2 other bikers moved to help him, their leather-clad figures looking oddly gentle as they picked up scattered crystals and chains. Tom stepped around his booth and joined them, showing them how to check for damaged pieces and sort them carefully. As they worked, he spoke quietly about craftsmanship, about the patience required to create something beautiful, about the responsibility that came with strength. The leader listened, occasionally asking questions about woodworking that revealed his own forgotten knowledge of crafts. The elderly woman, who had been watching with tears in her eyes, finally spoke up. "Those pieces you're holding," she said to the leader, "I made them thinking about my granddaughter. She loves butterflies." She pointed to a particularly delicate pendant in his hand, its wings now slightly bent from being stepped on. The leader examined the butterfly pendant, seeing it now not as just another piece of jewelry, but as someone's creation, someone's gift, someone's art. He remembered his father saying something similar about his rocking chairs, how each one was made with a specific person in mind, carrying stories and memories in every curve and joint. "I know someone who works with metal," he said, surprising himself again. "He could fix this, make it look new again." He carefully placed the pendant in the elderly woman's hand. "If you'd let me, I'd like to have it repaired for your granddaughter." The transformation in the atmosphere was complete. What had started as a moment of potential violence had become something entirely different, a reminder that beneath the toughest exteriors, beneath years of accumulated anger and practiced intimidation, there often lay forgotten connections to beauty and creation. Tom watched as the bikers helped reorganize the jewelry display, their earlier aggression replaced by careful attention to detail. He saw how the leader's crew looked at him differently now, with a new kind of respect that had nothing to do with fear. The security guards had relaxed, and families no longer hurried past the scene but stopped to watch and even help. As the last pieces were carefully arranged back on the display, the leader turned to Tom. "That box I damaged," he said, gesturing to the cracked jewelry box on Tom's booth, "I'd like to pay for it. And maybe..." He hesitated, looking almost embarrassed, "maybe you could tell me more about how you work with wood. It's been a long time since I thought about craftsmanship." The autumn sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the fairground. The carousel music played on, children laughed nearby, and the smell of popcorn and cotton candy drifted through the air. But something had changed in this small corner of the fair, something profound and unexpected. As Tom began to explain the process of creating the jewelry box, he noticed how the other bikers gathered around, genuinely interested. The younger one who had tried to escalate the situation earlier seemed especially fascinated, his earlier aggression replaced by curiosity. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes happen not through confrontation, but through finding unexpected common ground. As the afternoon light mellowed into early evening, Tom's woodworking booth had become an unlikely gathering place. The biker leader, who had introduced himself as Ray, sat on a wooden stool, carefully examining the joints of a small table while Tom explained the technique behind its construction. The rest of the crew had pulled up chairs, their leather jackets now unzipped in the warm air, their earlier hostility replaced by genuine interest. "My father used to say that dovetail joints were like puzzle pieces," Ray said, running his fingers along the smooth wood. "Each one had to be perfect, or the whole thing would fall apart." His voice carried a hint of nostalgia that surprised even his own crew members, who had never heard him speak of his past. The elderly jewelry maker, whose name was Rose, had brought over cups of lemonade from a nearby stand. She handed them out to everyone, including the young biker who had earlier been so eager for confrontation. He accepted the drink with a mumbled "thank you," his face flushed with what might have been embarrassment. "You know," Tom said, picking up a piece of cherry wood from his workbench, "I learned something valuable during my SWAT days that applies to both woodworking and life. It's not about how much force you use, it's about understanding the natural grain, working with it rather than against it." He demonstrated by running his hand along the wood's surface. "Every piece has its own story, its own direction." Ray nodded, understanding flowing deeper than just woodworking wisdom. "Like people," he said quietly. "You can't force them to be something they're not. You have to understand their nature." He glanced at his crew, seeing them in a new light, not just as followers, but as individuals with their own grains and patterns. The young biker, who had been silently observing, suddenly spoke up. "My grandfather was a carpenter," he said, his voice carrying a mix of defiance and vulnerability. "I used to watch him work when I was little. Never thought much about it until now." He paused, then added almost reluctantly, "He always wanted to teach me." Tom recognized something in the young man's voice, a longing for connection, for purpose beyond the tough exterior he wore like armor. "It's never too late to learn," he said, reaching for another piece of wood. "Would you like to try your hand at it?" The transformation in the young biker's face was immediate. His eyes lit up, though he tried to hide it behind a casual shrug. "Yeah, maybe," he said, but he was already standing up, moving closer to Tom's workbench. Rose watched this interaction with a knowing smile. She had been around long enough to recognize moments of genuine change when she saw them. "You know," she said, adjusting her display of newly reorganized jewelry, "art has a way of bringing out the truth in people. Whether it's wood, metal, or precious stones, working with your hands connects you to something real." The fair around them had begun to quiet down, families heading home for dinner, but the atmosphere at Tom's booth remained charged with possibility. Ray's crew members had started sharing their own stories. One had an uncle who was a metalworker, another's mother made quilts. Each revelation seemed to peel away layers of their hardened exteriors, revealing the people they were beneath the leather and attitude. Tom brought out some basic tools and began showing the young biker how to make a simple wooden box. The others gathered around, offering suggestions and questions, their earlier aggression forgotten in the face of creation. Even the fair security guards had joined the group, their initial wariness replaced by interest in the impromptu woodworking lesson. "The key," Tom explained as he guided the young man's hands, "is to respect the wood. Feel its grain, understand its strength and its limitations." He looked around at the gathered faces, seeing understanding dawn in their eyes. "When you approach anything, or anyone, with respect, you discover possibilities you never imagined." Ray stood up, still holding the damaged jewelry box he had earlier offered to pay for. "This reminds me of something my father used to say," he said, turning the box in his hands. "He said that every piece of furniture he made carried a piece of his story, and would become part of someone else's story too. The young biker's first attempt at sawing wood was crooked, but his face showed intense concentration. Tom noticed how Ray watched him with something like pride, not in the tough exterior the young man projected, but in his willingness to try something new, to be vulnerable in the pursuit of creation. As the evening shadows lengthened across the fairground, the group remained engrossed in their unexpected workshop. The sound of sawing and sanding mixed with conversation and occasional laughter. Passers-by stopped to watch, drawn by the unusual sight of leather-clad bikers earnestly learning about woodcraft from a former SWAT officer turned carpenter. The transformation that had begun with a moment of potential violence had blossomed into something extraordinary, a reminder that beneath the surface of every confrontation lay the possibility of connection, that every person carried within them the capacity for both destruction and creation. The choice, as Tom had shown, was simply in which path to nurture. The fair's lights had begun to twinkle in the gathering dusk, casting a warm glow over Tom's booth where the unlikely gathering continued. The young biker, now covered in sawdust, held up his first completed wooden box. Though the edges were slightly uneven and the joints weren't perfect, his face showed unmistakable pride as Tom inspected his work. "Not bad for a first try," Tom said, turning the box carefully in his hands. "You've got a natural feel for the wood. Your grandfather would be proud." The young man's tough exterior cracked further at these words, revealing a genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Ray watched this interaction with growing thoughtfulness. As a leader, he had always believed his strength came from maintaining an image of unwavering toughness. But here was Tom, clearly the strongest person among them, showing a different kind of leadership, one that built people up instead of tearing them down. "You know," Ray said, addressing his crew, "maybe we've been looking at strength all wrong." He picked up a piece of wood from Tom's workbench, feeling its weight in his hands. "All this time, we thought it was about who could be the toughest, who could scare people the most. But look at what real strength can build." Rose, who had been quietly working on her jewelry display, added her own wisdom to the conversation. "Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who know when to be gentle," she said, holding up a delicate silver necklace she had just repaired. "Like these metals, push too hard, and they break. Work with them carefully, and they become something beautiful." The fair's carnival music played softly in the background as more stories began to emerge. One of the older bikers revealed he'd been a shop teacher before losing his job during budget cuts. Another spoke about his daughter's interest in art, something he'd previously dismissed but now saw in a new light. Tom listened to these revelations while showing another crew member how to use a hand plane. "In my SWAT days," he said, demonstrating the smooth, controlled motion, "I learned that the most crucial moments often weren't about force at all. They were about understanding, about finding the right approach to each situation." As he spoke, a small group of children had gathered at the edge of the booth, watching with fascination as wood shavings curled away from the plane. One little girl, probably no more than 7, stepped forward bravely and asked, "Can I try?" The bikers instinctively made space for her, their imposing figures now forming a protective circle rather than a threatening one. Ray helped her up onto a stool while Tom guided her small hands on the plane, her delighted giggle at the resulting wood curl bringing smiles to everyone's faces. "My father would have loved this," Ray said quietly, watching the scene. "He always said his workshop was open to anyone who wanted to learn. I forgot that for a long time, got caught up in being someone else." He looked at his crew, seeing similar recognition in their eyes. The young biker who had made the box was now showing it to the children, explaining what he'd learned with surprising patience. Their parents, who had initially held back with concern, now stepped closer, drawn by the remarkable transformation they were witnessing. "You never know what impact a single moment can have," Tom mused, helping another child feel the grain of the wood. "Sometimes all it takes is one choice, one different path, to change everything that follows." Rose nodded in agreement as she began packing up her jewelry for the day. "Like ripples in a pond," she said. "What started as a confrontation has turned into something that might change many lives." She gestured to the young biker teaching the children. Look at him now, he's discovering who he really is, beneath all that tough exterior. Ray gathered his crew for a quiet conversation, their huddle now lacking its usual intimidating energy. When they broke apart, he approached Tom with purpose. We've been thinking, he said, glancing back at his crew for confirmation. Our club does a toy drive for kids every Christmas. Usually, we just buy stuff from stores, but maybe this year. He paused, looking almost shy. Maybe we could make some wooden toys ourselves? With your guidance, of course. The request hung in the air, representing far more than just a woodworking project. It was an opportunity for continued transformation, a chance to replace their reputation for intimidation with one of creation and community service. Tom's face broke into a warm smile. I think that's a wonderful idea, he said. My workshop's bigger than this booth, plenty of room for everyone to learn and work together. The fair was winding down around them, but the energy at Tom's booth remained vibrant with possibility. Parents were exchanging contact information with the bikers, asking about the future toy drive. The young biker had carefully wrapped his wooden box, announcing his plans to show it to his grandfather. As the group began to disperse, Tom noticed how differently they carried themselves. The biker's swagger had been replaced by something more genuine, a quiet confidence that came from creation rather than destruction. The children waved goodbye to their new unlikely friends, and even the security guards exchanged friendly nods with the crew. In the growing darkness, the fairground's lights created a magical atmosphere, as if illuminating not just the physical space but the transformation that had occurred within it. What had begun as a potential moment of violence had become a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful acts of strength lie not in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to create something new. As the fair prepared to close for the night, the impact of the day's events continued to ripple through the community. The local food vendor, who had watched the entire transformation unfold, approached the group with a tray of fresh pastries. On the house, she said with a warm smile. It's not every day we get to witness something this special. Tom's booth had become more than just a woodworking display, it had transformed into a symbol of how unexpected connections could bridge the deepest divides. The young biker, still beaming with pride over his wooden box, was helping Tom pack up his tools, handling each one with newfound respect and curiosity. You know what's funny, he said, carefully wrapping a chisel in protective cloth. I always thought being tough meant not caring about anything. But watching you work, seeing how much skill and patience it takes to create something, that's actually tougher than breaking stuff. Ray, who had been making notes about the Christmas toy drive plans, looked up with understanding in his eyes. Reminds me of when I first joined a bike crew, he reflected. Thought I had to prove myself by being the meanest one there. Never realized until today that real strength looks completely different. A local photographer who had captured the day's events approached the group, his camera hanging around his neck. Would you mind if I took a group photo? He asked. This is the kind of story our town needs, people coming together, breaking down barriers. The bikers looked to Ray for guidance, old habits still lingering. But their leader's response surprised them. Only if Tom and Rose are in it too, he said, gesturing to the elderly jewelry maker who was still nearby. They're the ones who showed us a better way. As they gathered for the photo, the contrast was striking, leather-clad bikers standing alongside a gentle carpenter and an elderly craftswoman, all surrounded by delicate wooden creations and sparkling jewelry. But somehow, it felt perfectly natural, as if the universe had conspired to bring these unlikely souls together. My father used to say that every piece of wood has a story, Ray said as they posed. Guess the same is true for people. You just have to be willing to look past the rough exterior to see it. The photographer captured the moment just as everyone broke into genuine laughter at Ray's unexpected wisdom. The fair's cleanup crew had begun their rounds, but they worked around Tom's booth, sensing that something important was still unfolding there. One of the workers, an older man, paused in his sweeping to share his own story. "I've been working these fairs for 20 years, he said, leaning on his broom. "Seen all sorts of things, but never anything quite like this. Usually, when we see a group of bikers, we brace for trouble. Today, you folks proved that change is possible at any moment." The young biker who had made the box was now deep in conversation with Tom about wood types and grain patterns. His questions revealed a genuine curiosity that had been buried beneath years of practice toughness. "Could we maybe start with something simple for the toy drive?" he asked. "Like wooden trains or cars?" Tom's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "That's perfect," he said, already reaching for his notebook to sketch some ideas. Simple shapes, but endless possibilities for creativity. Each child could get something unique. Rose, who had finally finished packing her jewelry, added her own suggestion. "We could add small details in metal," she offered. "Little silver wheels or copper accents. Make them extra special." The collaboration was already beginning, barriers between different crafts and different worlds dissolving. As night settled over the fairground, phone numbers and addresses were exchanged, plans were made for workshop sessions, and promises were given to stay in touch. The transformation that had begun with a moment of tension had blossomed into something no one could have predicted. A local business owner who had witnessed everything approached Ray. "You know," she said, "our community center has been looking for people to teach evening classes. If you and your crew are interested in sharing what you learn about woodworking, I think it could be wonderful for the neighborhood kids." Ray looked stunned for a moment, then thoughtful. The idea of his crew being seen as teachers rather than troublemakers was both strange and appealing. "We'll need to learn a lot more ourselves first," he said, glancing at Tom. "But yeah, maybe someday. One step at a time." The fair's lights were dimming one by one, but the warmth of connection remained bright. Tom watched as his new students carefully loaded their tools and materials into their bike saddlebags, treating each item with the same respect they would show to precious cargo. "Remember," he called out as they prepared to leave, "it's not about being perfect. It's about being patient, with the wood and with yourselves." The bikers nodded, understanding that his words carried wisdom far beyond woodworking. Just before mounting his motorcycle, Ray turned back to Tom. "You could have handled this whole thing differently," he said quietly. "Used your SWAT training, shown us up, made us back down by force. But you chose another way. That's a lesson I won't forget." Tom smiled, remembering countless situations in his former career where force had seemed like the only option. "Sometimes the strongest move is to offer understanding instead of confrontation," he replied. "You just have to be brave enough to take that first step." The sound of motorcycles starting up filled the night air, but it no longer carried a sense of menace. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new, a group of people heading home changed, carrying with them seeds of transformation that would continue to grow and spread throughout their community. The week following the fair brought changes that no one in Pine Grove could have anticipated. Tom's workshop, once a quiet sanctuary of sawdust and solitude, had become a gathering place for an unlikely group of apprentices. The sound of motorcycles pulling up outside no longer caused neighbors to peer anxiously through their windows. Instead, they waved and smiled, recognizing the transformation taking place. Ray and his crew had thrown themselves into learning woodworking with unexpected dedication. The young biker who had made his first box at the fair had visited his grandfather, bringing both the box and stories of his new apprenticeship. The elderly man had broken down in tears, pulling out his own old woodworking tools from the attic, tools that had gathered dust for years. "My grandfather's coming to the next session," the young biker announced proudly as he worked on a small wooden train. "Says he never thought he'd have the chance to work wood with me. Figured that dream died when I joined the crew." His hands, once used primarily for throwing punches, now moved with surprising gentleness as he sanded the toy's edges. The local newspaper had run a story about the fair incident, not focusing on the initial confrontation, but on the remarkable transformation that followed. The headline read, From Confrontation to Creation, How a Carpenter's Wisdom Changed Hearts. The article had sparked interest throughout the community, with other local craftspeople offering to share their skills. Rose had become a regular visitor to Tom's workshop, bringing her jewelry-making tools and teaching the bikers how to incorporate metal elements into their wooden creations. "Every piece tells a story," she would say, showing them how to attach tiny silver details to their wooden toys. "And now your stories are becoming part of something bigger." The impact rippled further. A local school principal had approached Tom about starting a weekend woodworking program for at-risk youth, with Ray and his crew serving as mentors. The idea of these once-feared bikers teaching children about patience, creativity, and craftsmanship struck many as revolutionary. "It's funny," Ray said one evening as they cleaned up the workshop. "We used to measure respect by how many people feared us. Now we're earning it by what we create, by what we give back." He held up a nearly finished rocking horse, its wooden surface smooth as silk. "My old man would have loved to see this." The transformation extended beyond the workshop. The crew members had started wearing their leather jackets with patches that featured woodworking tools alongside their usual insignia. Their bikes still commanded attention when they roared through town, but now they were just as likely to be carrying loads of lumber as they were to be heading to a rally. Tom watched all of this with quiet satisfaction, seeing how his SWAT training had served a purpose he never expected. Instead of subduing threats, he had helped transform them. Rather than controlling through force, he had guided through understanding. The skills he had learned for confrontation had become tools for connection. The toy drive project had grown beyond their initial plans. Other local businesses had gotten involved, offering materials and support. The crew's reputation had shifted so dramatically that when they set up a donation booth at the local mall, parents brought their children specifically to meet the woodworking bikers. "You've started something remarkable here," the local community center director told Tom one day. "These men aren't just learning a craft, they're rediscovering themselves. And they're showing others that change is possible at any point in life." The young biker who had made the first box had become particularly passionate about teaching others. He worked with special patience when children visited the workshop, kneeling down to their level to explain the properties of different woods, helping them sand with small pieces of sandpaper sized for their hands. "I keep thinking about all the kids like me," he said while working on a set of wooden blocks. "The ones who think being tough is the only way to be strong. If someone had shown me this kind of strength earlier." He left the thought unfinished, but everyone understood. One Saturday morning, the workshop hosted a special event, a father-child woodworking session. Ray's crew members helped guide pairs through simple projects, their tattooed arms steady as they demonstrated proper technique. The sight of these once intimidating men teaching parents and children about the importance of patience and attention to detail brought tears to more than a few eyes. "This is real legacy work," Ray said, watching his crew interact with the families. "Not the kind that comes from fear or power, but from passing on something valuable, something that builds rather than breaks." He ran his hand along a workbench, feeling the smooth wood worn by years of creation. "Tom showed us that strength isn't about what you can destroy, it's about what you choose to build." The workshop had become more than just a place to learn woodworking. It was a space where barriers broke down, where preconceptions dissolved, where the lines between teacher and student, tough and gentle, past and future blurred into something new and hopeful. As evening approached and the last families left the workshop, Tom stood in the doorway, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The sound of motorcycles starting up now carried a different meaning, not a threat, but a promise. A promise that change was possible, that understanding could triumph over force, that every person carried within them the potential for transformation. The sawdust-filled air sparkled in the last rays of sunlight, carrying with it the stories of countless pieces of wood shaped by caring hands, of lives redirected toward creation rather than destruction, of a community learning to see beyond surface appearances to the true grain of human nature beneath. 3 months after the fair, Pine Grove's community center buzzed with excitement. The annual Christmas toy drive, once a simple gift collection, had transformed into something extraordinary. Tables lined the main hall, each displaying handcrafted wooden toys that told stories of transformation, not just of wood, but of the people who made them. Tom stood near the entrance, watching as Ray and his crew carefully arranged their creations. Each toy had been made with remarkable attention to detail: trains with tiny silver wheels that really turned, rocking horses with flowing manes carved by hands that had learned the patience of true craftsmanship, and delicate music boxes that played soft melodies when opened. The young biker who had made his first box at the fair now worked alongside his grandfather, their matching leather aprons covered in sawdust as they put the finishing touches on a set of wooden building blocks. The elderly man's eyes shone with pride as he watched his grandson explain the properties of different woods to curious children. "Never thought I'd see the day," the grandfather said to Tom, his voice thick with emotion. "When he joined that crew, I thought I'd lost him. Now look at him, teaching kids about craftsmanship, about patience, about creating something beautiful. You gave me my grandson back." Rose had set up a small jewelry-making station next to the wooden toys, teaching children how to add simple metal decorations to their wooden treasures. The collaboration between her delicate metalwork and the biker's woodcraft had produced pieces that seemed almost magical: carousel horses with silver stars, trains with copper trim, and boats with tiny brass bells. "You know what's remarkable?" Ray said, adjusting a display of wooden cars. "These kids, they don't see us as those scary bikers anymore. They see us as creators, teachers. That's a kind of respect I never knew existed." He paused, watching a small girl carefully examining a wooden dolphin he had carved. "And it feels better than fear ever did." The local police chief, who had once viewed the biker crew with suspicion, now stood chatting with them about their next community project. The transformation had been so complete that he had asked them to help establish a crafts program at the youth detention center, believing that what had changed them could change others. "Sometimes the best way to prevent trouble is to give people something worth caring about," the chief said, picking up a wooden puzzle box. "You folks have proved that beyond any doubt." Parents who had once hurried their children past when they saw the bikers now brought them specifically to learn from these unlikely teachers. The crew members' tattoos and leather jackets had become associated not with threat but with the promise of patience, skill, and creativity. A local reporter, doing a follow-up story on the transformation, interviewed Tom about how it all began. "What made you choose understanding over confrontation that day at the fair?" she asked, notebook ready. Tom smiled, watching Ray demonstrate proper sanding technique to a group of enthusiastic children. "In my SWAT days, I learned that the most powerful weapon isn't force, it's the ability to see the potential for good in any situation. These men didn't need to be subdued, they needed to be reminded of who they could be." The young biker's grandfather had brought out some of his old woodworking magazines from the 1960s, and the crew gathered around during breaks, studying techniques from master craftsmen of the past. The magazines, yellowed with age, formed a bridge between generations, between old skills and new learners, between what was and what could be. As the day progressed, more people from the community arrived, drawn by the display of craftsmanship and the remarkable story behind it. A local business owner announced plans to sponsor a series of summer workshops where the bikers would teach woodworking to underprivileged youth. The idea of these once-feared men becoming mentors to the community's children seemed like poetry in motion. "It's like that first piece of wood I worked with at the fair," the young biker said, demonstrating to a child how to feel the grain. "You look at it one way, it's just a block of wood. Look at it another way, and you see all the possibility inside. Guess people are the same way." Rose, overhearing this, added her own wisdom as she helped a little girl attach a silver star to her wooden horse. "That's the real magic of crafting," she said. "It doesn't just transform the materials, it transforms the maker too." As evening approached, Tom noticed Ray standing quietly by the window, watching the sunset. "Thinking about your father?" Tom asked, joining him. Yeah, Ray nodded. He always said that working with wood was about more than making things, it was about making yourself better. Took me a long time to understand what he meant. He turned to look at his crew, now cleaning up after a day of sharing their skills and stories. But I think I finally get it. The community center gradually emptied as families left with their handcrafted treasures, each toy carrying with it a story of transformation. The bikers' motorcycles still stood outside, but now they were fitted with custom wooden cargo boxes, crafted to carry tools and materials rather than symbols of intimidation. As they prepared to leave, the young biker placed something on Tom's workbench, a perfectly crafted small box, its joints now flawless, its finish smooth as glass. "Made this for you," he said quietly. "To remind you of where it all started." One moment of understanding changed everything. Tom picked up the box, feeling its weight, appreciating the care put into every detail. Inside, he found a simple note: "Thank you for seeing the craftsman in me when I couldn't see it myself." The sun had set completely now, but the warmth in the community center remained. What had begun as a moment of potential violence at a small-town fair had grown into something that would continue to shape lives for generations to come. The transformation had rippled out far beyond Ray's crew, touching families, changing perspectives, and proving that sometimes the greatest acts of strength lie not in the ability to break, but in the courage to build something new. As the last motorcycle roared away into the night, its sound no longer carried fear but promise, the promise that within every ending lies the seed of a new beginning, and within every person lies the potential for remarkable change.